back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time we're going super deep into the world of memory formation.
Oh, yeah.
I'm so fascinated by this Quanta magazine article about how our brains might be using something called event scripts to structure memories.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's like, those memory champions
Right.
who use these elaborate memory palaces to store all this information.
Mm-hmm.
The article kind of suggests that event scripts might be like our brain's natural version of a memory palace.
That's a really cool way to think about it. It's like instead of these grand halls and rooms you have in a memory palace,
Right.
our brains have these neural frameworks based on, our recurring experiences.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So, like, what kind of experiences are we talking about?
Think about like going to a restaurant or catching a flight or just attending a lecture.
Right.
All these scenarios we encounter over and over
Wow.
kind of have a pre-built script in our brains.
Okay, so walk me through this event script idea a little bit more.
Sure.
Like, what exactly are they and how do they actually function in our brains?
Okay, so imagine like a pre-filled form.
Yeah.
You've got the basic outline,
Uh-huh.
the who, what, where already laid out.
Right.
That's your event script.
Okay.
And then as you go through life and experience variations within that event, the form gets more and more detailed.
I'm starting to get it.
Like, for example, your first restaurant experience as a kid,
Yeah.
What might have been a super basic script.
Yeah, like eat food, pay, leave.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But as you experience fine dining, different cuisines, maybe even bad service a couple times,
Right, right.
your restaurant script, becomes much more elaborate and nuanced over time.
So it's like our brains are constantly updating these scripts, like refining them to make them more useful.
Exactly.
Wow, that's so cool.
And what's really interesting is that psychologists, they actually proposed this idea of event scripts like decades ago.
Really?
Yeah. But back then, they didn't have the tools to actually study them in action. But now, with all the advancements in neuroscience,
Right.
particularly fMRI technology,
Okay.
we can actually observe these scripts playing out in the brain in real time.
Wait, hold on.
It's pretty amazing.
So you're telling me that researchers are using movies and TV shows to study memory?
Yeah.
How does that even work?
It's super clever. They have participants watch film clips while they're lying in an fMRI scanner, which measures brain activity.
Okay.
And then the researchers, they analyze the patterns of brain activity
Right.
that correspond to specific scenes and events in the film.
So it's like they're watching the brain light up as it's processing a story.
Yeah, basically. It's like watching the brain make memories.
That's incredible. So they can literally see how our brains respond to different narrative elements.
Yep.
That's got to be yielding some pretty interesting insights into memory formation.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Researchers like Christopher Baldassano at Columbia
Okay.
and Janice Chen at Johns Hopkins, they've been using this technique to uncover some pretty groundbreaking stuff about how our memories are formed.
Okay, so what kind of stuff are we talking about?
Well, for one, their findings are challenging some of our previous assumptions about memory.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, for instance, it turns out that memory isn't localized to just a few specific regions of the brain,
Oh, interesting.
but rather it involves almost the entire brain working together.
So it's not like there's like a little filing cabinet labeled memories tucked away somewhere in our brain.
Nope, not at all. It's much more dynamic and interconnected than that.
So how does it actually work then?
Well, Baldassano's research has actually revealed a fascinating two-step process in how memories are formed.
Okay.
First, our brains break down experiences into these fragments of varying lengths.
Uh-huh.
It's not like a constant recording,
Yeah.
It's more like a series of snapshots,
Interesting.
ranging from small details to major plot twists.
Okay, so then how does our brain actually make sense of all these fragmented snapshots?
Right. It can't just be a jumbled mess of images and sounds.
Right.
That's where those event scripts come in.
Okay.
In the second step, our brains use those pre-existing scripts like we were talking about before as frameworks to organize these fragmented memories.
Okay.
They provide the context,
Yeah.
the narrative structure
Yeah.
that allows us to actually make sense of what happened.
So instead of a continuous recording, our memory is more like a reconstructed film,
Exactly.
edited and pieced together using these event scripts.
That's a great way to put it.
So it's basically like our memories are stories that our brains are putting together using these like invisible frameworks.
Yeah, kind of like a behind-the-scenes director.
Right, exactly. And speaking of stories, the article talked about a study where people watching movies with strong script activation had better memory for the details. I'm curious, what exactly does script activation mean, like in this context?
So it basically refers to like how much a specific event script is engaged,
Yeah.
while you're processing new information. So for example, if you're watching like a typical romantic comedy,
Right.
your romantic relationship script is probably highly activated.
Hmm.
This allows you to kind of anticipate, certain plot points and how the characters are going to behave.
Oh, that makes sense.
And this familiarity actually frees up cognitive resources.
Okay.
So you can focus on those like unique details that make the movie memorable for you.
It's like it's not about memorizing every single little thing.
Yeah.
It's more about seeing that bigger picture,
Exactly.
the overarching narrative.
Yeah, it's kind of like how chess masters can remember these complex game positions
Right.
because they're not just seeing individual pieces, they're seeing patterns.
Because they have all that background knowledge.
Exactly. They're drawing on their extensive knowledge of the game.
That's a really good analogy. Okay. But what happens when, like, things don't go according to the script? What if there's, like, a surprise twist or an unexpected event? Does that throw our memory off track?
That's when it gets really interesting. The article touched on this idea of competing scripts,
Oh, okay.
where there might be, multiple storylines or contexts at play.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And do you remember that study we talked about earlier
Mm.
where the participants were listening to a proposal story?
Right, right.
Some were told to imagine they were restaurant critics,
Yeah.
while others were asked to imagine they were wedding planners.
Okay. Yeah. So depending on their role, they were kind of primed to focus on different parts of the story.
Exactly. And that priming had a big impact on what they actually remembered.
Really?
Those who were primed as restaurant critics remembered a lot more about the food and the atmosphere.
Yeah, right. The ambiance.
Exactly. Well, the wedding planners, they were much more focused on the proposal itself and the couple's emotions.
Wow. So it's really highlighting how memory isn't this passive recording.
Right.
Like our mental state, our perspective is actively shaping what we encode and ultimately remember. That's so wild. So even if we experience the exact same event, our individual interpretations and pre-existing scripts can lead to completely different memories.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy to think about.
It makes you wonder about things like eyewitness testimony and how reliable those accounts actually are.
Yeah, definitely something to think about.
But before we go down that rabbit hole, I want to loop back to something you mentioned before.
Sure.
If our memories are so malleable, so influenced by these event scripts, does that mean we can train our brains to remember things better?
That's the exciting part. This research actually suggests that by understanding how these event scripts work,
Yeah.
we can actually learn to leverage them to make our memories stronger.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah, for instance, one of Baldassano's studies involved teaching participants the method of loci,
Okay.
which is also known as the memory palace technique.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. That's what those memory champions use, right?
Exactly.
To memorize like tons and tons of information.
Yeah, it's a classic mnemonic strategy.
Right.
It involves associating items you want to remember with specific locations in a familiar environment.
Okay, so like associating things with rooms in your house.
Yeah, exactly like your home.
Okay, but how does that tie back into event scripts?
Well, it's all about using existing mental structures to organize new information by creating vivid mental images and then placing those images within a familiar spatial framework.
Yeah.
You're essentially building a new event script in your brain.
Oh, that's so cool. And it actually worked.
The results were actually pretty remarkable.
Wow.
The participants who learned the method of loci, they significantly improved their ability to remember lists of words.
So we can really get better at remembering things by consciously creating new scripts or modifying existing ones.
It seems that way.
That's amazing. This has implications way beyond just memorizing lists of words. Like,
Right.
could we use this to remember names, dates, historical facts?
Yeah, potentially even entire presentations.
Wow, that opens up a whole new world of possibilities.
It really does.
And it shows us that our brains are way more adaptable and malleable than we think.
Absolutely.
This is also fascinating. We've gone from these memory palaces to movie-watching brain scans,
It's quite a journey.
all to try to figure out how our memories work.
Yeah.
And it turns out our brains are basically master storytellers,
Seems like it.
constantly weaving our experiences into these narratives that are shaped by these invisible frameworks.
Pretty incredible, right?
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what other hidden scripts are running in our brains,
Yeah.
shaping our perceptions and influencing our decisions without us even realizing it.
That's a really interesting thought.
Yeah, and maybe by becoming more aware of these underlying scripts, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and how we fit into the world.
Definitely worth thinking about.
Absolutely. But before we get too philosophical, I want to go back to something you briefly mentioned earlier.
Okay.
The implications of event scripts for eyewitness testimony. You said that this research kind of raises some concerns about the reliability of memory in legal contexts.
Yeah, it definitely adds another layer of complexity.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? So it seems like relying on these event scripts is pretty helpful for, navigating our everyday lives.
Yeah, for sure.
But when it comes to something as serious as eyewitness testimony,
Right.
that's where things get a little tricky.
Exactly. Eyewitness accounts, they often carry a lot of weight in legal proceedings.
Yeah, for sure.
But all this research on event scripts really makes you question
Mm.
whether memory is really this accurate and objective recording of events.
Right. So how do event scripts actually impact the accuracy of eyewitness testimony?
Well, think about like a witness to a robbery.
Okay.
Their robbery script might include certain expectations,
Uh-huh.
like a masked perpetrator, a weapon, maybe even a getaway car,
Yeah, the classic imagery.
right? And these pre-existing notions, they can actually influence what the witness pays attention to during the event.
Oh.
And then what they end up remembering later on.
Oh, so they might fill in missing details
Exact.
or even misremember certain aspects based on their script.
Yeah, even if they're genuinely trying to tell the truth.
Wow, it's almost like our brains are trying to fit the events into this familiar story template,
Right.
even if the reality is way more complicated.
Exactly. And that can have some pretty serious consequences.
Yeah. Isn't there a chance that this could lead to wrongful convictions?
Unfortunately, yes.
Oh, wow.
Studies have actually shown that eyewitness misidentification,
Mm-hmm.
it's a leading factor in wrongful convictions.
That's really concerning.
Yeah, and this whole thing with event scripts just makes it even more complicated.
Right, because it's not intentional.
Right.
It's just how our brains work.
Exactly. And then you add in things like stress and trauma and just the passage of time.
Yeah,
All of that can further distort memories.
right.
It makes relying on eyewitness testimony even more risky.
So what can we do about this? Is there any way to separate the real memory from the influence of these event scripts?
Well, it's a tough question,
Yeah.
but there are definitely things we can do to at least mitigate the risks.
Okay, like what?
For example, law enforcement officials are getting more and more training
Okay.
in techniques that help to minimize bias during witness interviews.
That makes sense.
And in courtrooms, expert witnesses can be called upon
Right.
to explain the science of memory
Yeah.
and, talk about the potential problems with eyewitness testimony.
Right, for the jury.
Exactly.
So it sounds like we need a more well-rounded approach to make sure that justice is served,
Yeah.
while also recognizing that human memory just isn't perfect.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a really thought-provoking deep dive.
It has.
We've learned so much about how our brains use these hidden scripts to try to make sense of the world, and while that can be really helpful in a lot of ways, it also raises some really important questions about, how we interpret information and how much we can actually trust our own memories.
It definitely highlights the importance of critical thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
We can't just accept everything at face value.
Right?
We need to question our assumptions, be open to different perspectives,
Mhm.
and just acknowledge that, our own biases and mental frameworks,
Yeah,
they can really influence how we see the world.
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, this is great.
You've given us a lot to think about.
I hope so.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to think about the event scripts that might be operating in your own lives.
Yeah.
How might they be shaping your memories, your decisions, even your perception of reality?
It's worth considering.
And maybe by understanding these frameworks, we can all become a little more mindful, more critical in our thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and ultimately more aware of the power and the potential pitfalls of our own minds.
Well said.
Thanks again for joining us, and until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those deep dives coming.
See you next time.